Greetings, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about how to get your scales going from sounding like someone practicing a scale to someone making music with a scale. Pretty cool. Check it out. Okay, so today we're talking about how to make your scales sound more musical and less like practice. Now, I've got my guitar out and I'm using an A minor pentatonic scale in its traditional first position. That's just to start, but this stuff can be applied to any scale, and there are definitely things that can be applied to any instrument. So what I've done is I've broken it down into 5 main categories of techniques and concepts you can apply to your scale, and it's going to make it sound way more interesting and cohesive rather than someone just sort of running drills. Let's get stuck into it. Number 1 on the list is change the order of the notes. I know it seems really obvious, but it's worth talking about it with a little bit more detail. So quite often we learn a scale, we start at the lowest note, we go in ascending order to the highest note, turn around and come home. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but this is definitely someone practicing a scale. I mean, you know, it could be a riff, but it's kind of pretty boring. So what can I do? I can change the order of the notes. Now what this means is that I can start skipping notes, I can start repeating notes, I can do anything I like. For today, I'm going to stick in my little first position box so it's nice and simple. And let's just see, if I start by playing the scale up and down in a traditional way, then I'm going to open up the floodgates and say, oh, well, I can play the notes in any order I like. I can repeat notes, I can skip notes. And let's just see what that does to the sound of the scale. So up and down to begin. Okay, let's introduce some order of notes. Okay, I mean, it was definitely more interesting, but I don't know about you, but it's not the most cohesive sounding thing I've ever heard. I mean, I don't think any of you are going to walk away humming that melody that I just played, yeah? It was just far too chaotic and random, yeah? So I can change the order of the notes. But it's a little bit sort of unconnected, and it's a little bit hard for people to grasp onto. So one thing you've got to consider when you're changing the order of the notes is basically all music that we're used to listening to involves some form of pattern and repetition. This is really important to remember. So I can change the order of my notes, no sweat, but I want to do it with a little bit of pattern or repetition. It gives the music an element of predictability to the listener, yeah? So if everything's completely random, it's very difficult for people to latch onto it and connect with it. Whereas if I give them an element of pattern and predictability, they're going to feel more connected to what's happening. So one of the most classic ways to get pattern and repetition into your scale is to use sequencing, which would be maybe taking a little phrase like 4 notes, and then starting that same phrase the next note down in the scale. So for example, on the A, and then from the G, and then from the E, and so on. So we've done these things before, I know, but trust me, I'm getting to something here. So the whole thing would sound like this. Okay, so that's cool, but it still sounds like someone practicing a scale. So on its own, nothing too amazing just yet, but we want to think about it like this. This definitely has that element of predictability I talked about. Yeah, I know what's happening here. Okay, but what I want to think about is the analogy I quite often use with students is when we're talking about patterns and repetition, it's like, I call it the Goldilocks syndrome. Is, you know, when Goldilocks walks in and she's got like 3 bowls of porridge, one's too hot, one's too cold, and one's just right. So I want to think about that in relation to patterns and repetition. So if I have heaps of patterns in a row, it's really predictable. I would say there's too much repetition going on. So I've gone too far on one side. So you could say, oh, the porridge is a little bit too hot. So yeah, a little bit practicey. But like I said before, if I don't have any pattern whatsoever and go completely random, it's a little bit too cold. There's no pattern, no predictability. It's a little bit alienating for people to listen to. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the porridge just right. We want to have just enough predictability to keep the listener sort of going, oh, I think I know what's going on here. But we also want to throw in surprises. So a little bit of unpredictability. So the trick here is getting the balance just right. So a great simple way to do this, instead of doing an entire scale using the same pattern all the way from the bottom to the top, what if I just did a few of them and then chose like just a nice finishing note, just a long note to finish on? So in this example, what if I start at the top and let's say, well, it's worth thinking about, like in different contexts, you might be able to get away with more or less of these repetitions. But let's say, what if I just do 3 of these repetitions and then get out? All right, so I'm going to do 3 of them and then pick an ending note, like that. Suddenly to me, that's more of a musical statement. It didn't really sound like someone practicing a scale. It was someone doing something slightly repetitious, but it finished up on a nice little ending note. Now that I've got that, that's pretty cool. I could repeat that, but choose a different ending note. To me, I don't know, it seems like such a simple idea, but I've got the same little small amount of repetition, little bit of predictability, but a couple of different ending notes. To me, that's making a musical statement. It's developing, it's connected. I think it's, trying to find that just right temperature of the porridge, yeah? So when we're changing the order of the notes, we want to think about patterns and repetition, but keep it interesting, yeah? Keep it unpredictable, but not completely chaotic, yeah? So that's something that you can explore. This is literally something that just the more you do it, the more you'll gain experience and learn how to pick the best path or what the best level of predictability is for you. So that's number 1 on my list of things to make scales sound musical. Checking out the order of the notes and not just throwing them around randomly, but doing it with a little bit of forethought and listening to the effects, yeah? So remember the Goldilocks thing. We don't want the porridge to be too hot, so we don't want like heaps of repetition and heaps of patterns so it's a bit boring. We don't want the porridge to be super cold where it's just like chaotic, random and alienating. We want the porridge to be just right. Awesome. So moving on to number 2. Number 2 is without doubt one of the biggies. This is really obvious when I say it out loud, but we're going to apply this to the scale, and it's of course rhythm. Of course we're going to talk about rhythm. I mean, why wouldn't we? It's like my favorite thing in the whole world. So we're going to play the scale, but what I can now do is I can start now thinking about rhythm. I can think about fast notes, slow notes, long notes and short notes, and all of the combinations therein, and I'm going to create some really interesting sounds. So this one to me is actually one of the most, on its own, powerful devices. I'm going to play the scale up and down, purely ascending order, purely descending order, like no order of notes changing here, up and down. But I'm going to go up and down a couple of times normal. Then I'm going to open up the idea that I can play those notes in any rhythm, but I will maintain my constant ascent and descent. So I'm not repeating any notes, I'm not skipping, I'm just changing the rhythm. And let's see what that does to the sound of this scale. So here we go, up and down as per normal. We'll go up and down once more just for good measure. Oh yep, this is me practicing. Okay, here we go, some rhythm. Now, I don't know about you, but that had quite a big impact on the sound, yeah? What I've done by playing rhythm is I've created a stronger sense of pulse. I was able to create syncopation. By using short notes, I was able to create like phrases, so I can put some gaps in there. This one's powerful. So I can do small phrases, I can do fast stuff, slow stuff. This one is like almost infinite in the amount of different ways you can apply it to the scale, but it's really worth thinking about what can I do rhythmically to this scale to make it more interesting. So you could pick a sort of standard rhythm and just repeat it throughout the scale. So I could do something really simple like 1E and 2E and 3E and 4E and 1E and 2E. Even that little gap in there sounds a little bit more interesting. So definitely worth checking out rhythmic variation on your scales. So you can do this with just straight ascending and descending, and you're going to create some interesting ideas. But of course, if I was just to start throwing those two ideas, now they're just the first two off the list, and arguably, yeah, they're the two biggest impacting ones that everyone's aware of and everyone will do. But if I apply those two concepts to my scale, instantly, if I apply them well, I've got really great musical phrases coming out. So again, if I start in traditional ascending, descending order, no rhythmic variation, now I'm going to open up the floodgates. I can change the order and I can change the rhythm. That's definitely sounding like more musical and not someone practicing a scale. And that's the whole idea. Okay, so that's the first two categories. The next category is a much more subtle one, and I feel like it's a bit underutilized in a lot of contemporary music, but this is really powerful, very expressive, and we're talking about dynamics. And dynamics is just a fancy word for volume. So now I'm going to think about changing the way I play these notes with volume. So this can include things like crescendos, where I'm slowly getting louder, decrescendos, where I'm slowly getting quieter. I think also in this category I place accents, which is just like a louder note buried in a series of quieter notes. So you can have a whole run of notes and one of them's a bit louder than the others. That's really, really cool. That's a great dynamic device that we can use. So just expressive. Now this one, dynamics on its own, isn't going to have the most huge effect, but it's really important to remember this is one that you'll throw in with the other techniques. All these categories are meant to be mixed together. No one of them stands on its own as being, oh, that makes everything musical. You've got to use them in combination. But let's just have a listen to the scale with a bit of dynamics. So what I might try doing, just for a great sense of practice, it's also really good for pick control if you're on a guitar, or finger control if you're on the bass. If you're playing piano, finger control, really worth working on dynamics. Let's try playing the scale up and down, traditional order, but I'm going to start real quiet and see if I can get this word really loud at the top and then bring it really quiet on the way back down. So I'm going to crescendo on the way up and decrescendo on the way down. Let's see if I can do it. It's going to sound like this. Now that's really cool. Again, it's very subtle, but it's going to have a really great impact. I mean, you don't want all your music to be at this volume. It's the quiet bits and the loud bits and the contrast between them that gives music its life and its energy and its flow. So the other one I talked about was accents. Now, to me, accents are like super, super powerful, really great ways of getting awesome expression out of your phrases. So what I could start doing with this one, really simple, is I could just play up and down my scale. And let's just say I accent every fourth note, for example. So I'm just going to pick every fourth note a little bit louder and see what that sounds like. So I'm going to go. Awesome. Simple, but what that's given you hopefully is now we have a sense of a pulse. It sounds like we're going 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4, which is awesome. But if I was just to accent like every third note, it might give us like a triplet effect. So I could go. Super cool. Same notes, but I've implied a different pulse, which is really cool. So yeah, dynamics and accenting, super expressive, subtle, but when feathered in with the other categories, it's really important to get this stuff underneath your fingers. Okay, so that's order of notes, rhythm, and dynamics. Category number 4 is technique. So technique will be specific to your instrument of choice. On the guitar, we're going to be exposed to things like slides, legato, bending, vibrato, things like that. So these, again, on their own, they're not going to have the hugest impact on your scale, but as far as giving your phrases or your lines expression and uniqueness, technique is the most important thing to work on. You know, you want to play your notes, but you want to make them sound like you. Expression of technique is one of your best avenues to get that sound. So we can start applying sliding to the scale. Pretty cool. We could do legato. And that's going to sound cool. We can obviously do bending because we're playing a pentatonic scale. And vibrato, a little bit of vibrato on everything. Super cool. So we want to think about applying techniques, yeah? Really important expressive tool. But again, these ones on their own aren't going to have the hugest effect on your scale. What you're going to do is we're going to start applying these to little licks and phrases that we come up with using the first two categories. So, you know, you get some different orders of notes and some cool rhythms, and then we go, oh, well, let's feather that with some dynamics, some accenting, and some techniques like sliding, bending, and vibrato. Those ones are really, really important, definitely worth checking out, but I feel like those ones you're going to probably add to licks rather than playing an entire scale using like sliding. It's not the most effective, but from a practice point of view, it's worth working on so you get comfortable with the technique. But as far as making the scale sound musical, you're probably going to apply them a little bit later on down the train. Okay, and the final category for today is tone. So tone is a really cool thing that you can muck around with. It's going to give, again, subtle but really lovely variation to licks and phrases. So the guitar is quite unique in that you can play the same note in multiple different spots on the guitar, and each of them has a different tone. Really, really cool. So the way this one works for me is, like, for example, if I took my open E string up here, that's an E note. It's on a nice long, thin E string. I can move that note to the 5th fret on the B string. What's actually happening now is I'm actually playing this on a thicker and slightly shorter string. It has a subtly different tone. It's just a little bit warmer, whereas the open string is quite bright. If I move it again to the G string here on the 9th fret, it's a thicker string again and even shorter again, so the tone is even warmer. And you can really start to hear the difference between these. It's getting a little bit brighter as I go back that way. Pretty cool. I can head this over to the 14th fret on the D string. There's another E. You can hear that one's quite different. Very thick, very short string. It's almost like you can hear the notes getting a little bit brighter as I go back. On this guitar, I happen to have one more on the A. Very, very short, very, very thick string. Really round note. I've got 5 subtly different tones of that same note. So I could start thinking about playing licks and moving them to different spots on the guitar to get different tonal options. So if I had some kind of lick that I wrote, like simple like that on my original pattern, I could move that whole lick up here and it's a little bit warmer. Back here it's a bit twangier. I can move it back to these open strings. It's quite bright there. Up here, really, really interesting. So that's a subtle one, but definitely worth thinking about, you know? So you can play your licks and you can get them to sort of open up as you move them back and up onto the higher strings. So that's something to think about. So what have we got? We've got order of notes, we've got rhythm, we've got dynamics, we've got technique, and finally we had tone. So those 5 things, if you can apply them to any given scale that you've learned, this is kind of how you're going to make it sound like music and not someone just running drills, yeah? All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and put all of these things together. I'm going to start by playing the scale in its traditional ascending and descending order, no variation of rhythm, nothing, just going up and down, sounding like practice. And I'm going to slowly introduce each of these categories and see if by the end of it, I'm not making some form of music. So here we go. There you go. Well, that was just a quick little demo, bit of an idea about these concepts put together in the right order can sound pretty cool. Anyway, stuff to think about. Hope that was helpful. Till next time, see you soon.